Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show. I'm your host, Bobbycapucci, and I have a very special guest for you today. I am joined by Dr. Stephen DeLay. How you doing today, Dr. DeLay?
I'm doing very well.
Thank you for joining us here on the program. I know that the audience and myself, everyone's really excited to hear you. The letter was fantastic. It has had rave reviews amongst my audience, and I have received many, many emails of people who are very excited to hear you talk today. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and I'm really pleased to be here and have the opportunity to discuss the situation at Harvard and a little bit more about the letter. So thank you very much for the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important that people understand that it is not everybody who's involved in the higher academic structure of the world, because what it seemed like for people who were following the case from afar and people who were digging in, it seemed like nobody was coming out. The colleagues of these scientists were coming out and decrying what they did and speaking up. So it's more impactful, in my opinion, when it comes from somebody who is in the field. You know what I mean?
No, I certainly agree. In fact, I'm sure we're going to touch on this as we progress. But, I was pretty disappointed to see how few of my colleagues in higher education have really taken this situation on squarely. And I think that, unfortunately, the response you might think there should be from faculty and administrators at Harvard and also from MIT, for that matter, just hasn't been forthcoming. And of course, that's disappointing. I will say, and we can get to this later, but in recent days, I've been encouraged to see that a number of people are coming forward and supporting the petition that we've started with Uncoke My Campus. The petition is designed to call for a significant fundamental reform to the donation policies at MIT and Harvard, so that bad philanthropy of the sort that Epstein was notorious for just doesn't creep into higher ed. And yesterday, the petition thankfully really took off, and there's a ton of signatures. And I should also add, as for the letter itself, which I know we're going to discuss, while I wrote the letter, I am pleased to say that we did have some people who co-signed it with me. Some philosophy professors, Kate Mann at Cornell University, Jeff Malpas, he's at the University of Tasmania in Australia, Christos Hadjinunan, he's a colleague of mine, and then also an economics professor, Dave Rapich, who's done great work on exposing bad philanthropy in higher education for a number of years. And there was also a series of letters, we can get into this again later, but that went to MIT in the fall, and we had a number of people sign those letters as well. So there are people who are doing the right thing and trying to speak out about it, but it's certainly not as many people as we would like to see at this point, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think we've seen a lot of that in every single industry where Jeffrey Epstein had his tentacles dug in. And you see it especially in finance, in the finance industry, how quickly people are trying to distance themselves from Jeffrey Epstein instead of just meeting it head on and facing the fact that they were involved in enabling the man. They just seem to just try and kick it down the road and ignore the fact that they had a part in all of this. So it's nice to see that your colleagues and people are starting to come out and speak out against this, because this is a serious injustice. And the fact that this man had an office at Harvard, where he had access to all of those young girls, et cetera, it is just mind blowing to me that this was allowed to occur.
Yeah, it's really, it is truly mind-boggling. I had heard of Jeffrey Epstein a number of years ago, I think as many people had. I've been following this situation as it evolved. And so when he was arrested, frankly, I was really surprised that he was arrested at all. And I sort of had this sneaking suspicion that he was going to probably be killed. And so when he was, I was really devastated, because I was hoping that maybe there was going to finally be justice. And so it was disappointing to see the cover-up go into effect. And, my motivation for writing this letter really is just that in reading about what the survivors have gone through, the abuse that they faced from Epstein, from his co-conspirators, from his associates, is just truly terrible abuse, just really unconscionable, awful things. And then to see that kind of really evil abuse perpetrated, and then in some ways sort of condoned by law enforcement and the legal system, and now the corporate media. It's just very sad to see. And, my hope is that everybody can come together and do what they can to support the survivors in whatever small way that is. Because, frankly, as a lot of the survivors have said, whether it's Maria Farmer or others, the Epstein story has revealed to the public that there are incredibly powerful institutions, organizations that are involved in human trafficking. They're involved in harming children, and something needs to be done about it. And, I've seen it said justifiably that the survivors have been so courageous in overcoming all the obstacles they have, all the threats that they've received, and all the gaslighting and the abuse. And it's certainly true that they've been courageous. But I think it's sad in a way that has to be the situation, that survivors of sexual abuse and human trafficking have to be brave. It shouldn't be that way. We should have a society where these sorts of abuses and crimes aren't acceptable, that people who are abused in that way feel safe, they're allowed to report the offenses to the proper authorities, and that those misdeeds are investigated in the way that they should be. And so, we should have a society where the predators are in fear. And hopefully it'll be possible to change things and bring that about.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with all of that. It's the same thing for me. My mom, my field of study has always been more political science. I've always been involved in, geopolitics in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. That's what I studied in school. But when I started researching this case, at first, it was all a corruption angle for me. I was really, really focused on government corruption and misdeeds of the FBI and the Justice Department. But like you said, when you start to read the stories of these survivors, and me personally, once I started to build a relationship with people like Maria, it really hit a different note for me, because I have never been an advocate kind of person. I'm not a believe all women guy or none of that stuff. I've always been a believe the evidence person. But what I've come to find here in this case is we're not dealing with just circumstantial evidence here. We're dealing with just loads and loads of public evidence, and nobody thought it was a good idea to do anything about it. And it really doesn't sit well with me. I feel like if we don't speak out, we're almost complicit as well at this point.
I agree entirely. And, there's just two questions I think maybe the audience might keep in mind as we discuss things further. And the first question to me is, how is it possible for Jeffrey Epstein to gain the sort of access that he did to the sort of elite institutions he did, whether it's Harvard or MIT? And the second question is, why is it now that this has been exposed and that Harvard and MIT have admitted to a degree the relationship that they had forged with Epstein, why is it the case that nevertheless there's so little media scrutiny about this and relatively few people in higher education speaking out about it? Now, I think those two questions in principle are distinguishable, but I think when you focus on the second question, namely the lack of a serious response to the revelation of these issues, why is that? That you begin to kind of peel away the layers to the onion and get to the kind of cabal or the power structure that's really behind these institutions, which Jeffrey Epstein was tapped into. So that's one thing that I'm hoping I might be able to address today. I don't really think that I necessarily have anything to say that hasn't already been documented or researched, but I think it's worth iterating nonetheless. And I think maybe just perhaps because of my personal background in higher education, I can speak to being at these institutions and knowing the people involved and actually corroborate and confirm that these kinds of evil forces really are at work. And they really do explain why Jeffrey Epstein somehow, incredibly, was able to maintain an office at Harvard University as a convicted sex offender.
Yeah, and that's why I was really excited to have you on the program today, because it's one thing for me to explain to them, secondhand knowledge. I'm not involved in that part of the world. I'm not a professor or on campus as a teacher or anything like that. So it's one thing for me or other journalists to explain things from the outside looking in. But when you can get somebody who has intimate knowledge of what's going on, like you, it adds a lot more context. And what it does, it's a lot more impactful, in my opinion. So
Right.
it's very important that people like you that are, following this case and are outraged, that you continue to speak out, because there was a time where I felt like, I don't know if you're familiar with Game of Thrones or not, but I felt like Jon Snow during the Battle of the Bastards, standing there with a sword alone and nobody coming to help. That's how I felt for the last few months. And then,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
oh no, that's okay. And just now, though, it seems like this war has opened up on many fronts and reinforcements are starting to arrive. And I'm very thankful for it, because this has been a grind on a day in and day out basis for me. This is some heavy shit.
No, I think the work that you've been doing and other independent journalists and media content creators has just been fabulous. And of course, we can get to this later, but in some ways, you're doing the work that the so-called journalists should be doing.
Yeah.
You're doing the work that the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, they should be doing this, and they're not doing it. And so someone's going to have to, and I really admire the fact that you've been keeping up with the story. I know it's been a source of personal encouragement to me to see you follow the case, and I know others feel that way as well. So I really do appreciate the work that you've been doing on the story.
Hey, thank you very much. And, for me, I'm just, an average guy. I don't take myself too seriously. I'm not Walter Cronkite or anything like that. My role in this case is to follow the news and curate that news and break it down and read between the lines on a daily basis. Because as you stated earlier, it's very obvious the gaslighting campaign that's occurring. And if people don't understand that they have to read between the lines, they're never going to understand that they're being lied to. So I'm thankful my whole entire life. My father has always been a question everything kind of guy. So ever since I was a little kid, I was questioning everything. And I'm sure that bothered him, because that even meant questioning him as well. So, my whole life I've been asking the hard questions. I've always been that person that would walk into a room and ask that kind of question. So when this whole thing started with this case, and I was just so blown away by it that I couldn't sit on the sidelines, knowing that I had the ability to help out in my own little way. And it's just a little piece of the puzzle. Like I say on the podcast all the time, it's really about everybody who's listening and those hordes of people like you who are following the case and getting involved proactively on their own, with no benefit to themselves, just because they see how disgustingly evil and wrong this all is, and that they're spurred into action. And I think that's something that most of us share, that common bond that has pushed us all over the edge in this case.
Right. I mean, perhaps I'm simply an optimist, but I think at this point that there's many people who are beginning to join the fray to whatever capacity they can, and there will be more people continuing to do so. And I think it's just really important for everyone to understand that we shouldn't give up, and we shouldn't sell ourselves short and just assume like, well, because I don't work for the New York Times, or I don't work for the Boston Globe, or I don't work at Harvard, there's nothing I can do. Frankly, that's not the case. And, the people who are really behind this, they want people to feel that way. That's part of the psychological warfare, is to demoralize people, to condition them into a place of learned helplessness, where they sort of just basically become kind of catatonic and don't take action because they're sort of defeated before they begin.
Yeah, the biggest problem that the world has ever come across when it comes to programming is that oblong box in your living room. The things, the way that you're programmed via the programming on TV, and it's funny that it's called programming, right? The way that they program you with their just constant gaslighting, it just blows me away that so many people get caught up in it. And especially now, considering that they've established a track record for being liars, going all the way back to the Gulf of Tonkin, for God's sakes. And the fact that people still continue to eat it, spoon feed it up, and not question the narrative, it's mind-boggling. But like you were saying, people are starting to wake up now, and people have had time to ruminate on all of the wrongs in the last few months, and I see it. People are really, really starting to wake up to just how evil these people in power truly are.
Oh, yeah. So listen, if we're going to take a trip down the rabbit hole, should I just introduce myself? I know we've already been talking for a bit, but maybe if I give the listeners a little bit of perspective on my background, it'll give them some context as to the perspective from which I'm approaching the situation.
Most definitely. So what we'll do is we'll start here. We'll get a little bit of background here of Dr. DeLay, who he is, and what his role is on campus, et cetera, et cetera. So this will give you guys more context to understand who it is that is talking to you. Okay, Mr. DeLay. So you've been obviously involved in education for quite some time now, right?
Right. So I've been in higher education in one capacity or another as a student or an instructor now for 15 years. I took my first degree, a bachelor's in philosophy and political science, California Polytechnic State University, San Luis Obispo. And at the time, I was deciding whether I should go to law school or to graduate school in philosophy. And I didn't understand at the time that academia is in many ways, unfortunately, as corrupt as the law. And so I decided to pursue a career in philosophy. So I went to Rice University, where I completed a master's degree at Rice, after which I then went on to Oxford University, where I completed a DPhil, or a PhD in philosophy. Now, Oxford is important in many ways to the situation. It's important for reasons I'll explain that, as I think your listeners know, Ghislaine Maxwell attended Oxford, for example. She was at Balliol College. Yeah. Jacob Rothschild, who Maria Farmer has mentioned in the context of Ghislaine Maxwell, mentioning that the Rothschild family were the so-called great protectors of her family, the Maxwell family. Jacob Rothschild went to my college at Oxford, the college I attended, Christ Church. So I have some personal familiarity with these places. Oxford is a very unique and rather strange place. Just to give your listeners a basic sense, layout of the land, there are 39 constituent colleges at Oxford. The college I was at is called Christ Church. It was founded in the 16th century by Thomas Wolsey, and then it sort of disappeared for a bit and was reconstituted by King Henry VIII in 1546. It's the only Oxford college that also serves as a cathedral. As you know, King Henry VIII was involved in founding the Anglican Church in England, and so the Diocese of Oxford is actually at Christ Church, the college. There's a cathedral there. Now, Christ Church is the wealthiest of the Oxford colleges. I think it has something around 570 million pounds. It's produced 13 British prime ministers, and a number of really famous people are associated with the college. Lewis Carroll of Alice in Wonderland. I don't know whether you've seen Harry Potter, but the Great Hall in Hogwarts was actually filmed at the hall at Christ Church. Albert Einstein spent time studying there. There's also a number of really famous philosophers who have come out of Christ Church, Oxford, like John Locke, Michael Dummett, and also a couple people who we might discuss later in the context of Epstein, which John Searle and Dan Dennett. So the question is, as I mentioned before, how could Jeffrey Epstein gain access to a place like Harvard? He has no credentials, no degree, no publications. He's not an academic. Why would he be there? How could he get there? I think one way to approach the issue, and there's many layers to this and many angles from which it can be approached, but one way to sort of set the stage, as it were, I think, is to look at a rather famous quotation from Woodrow Wilson. This is 1913, right after the end of the presidential campaign. There was a book published called The New Freedom, which was a collection of campaign speeches that he had given in the preceding years. And in one of the chapters, it's called The Old Order Changes. Woodrow Wilson has this to say, I quote, "Since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there's a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. End quote. Now, Wilson, I think, has in mind primarily the financial and industrial magnates and powers of the time. You can think of the Rockefellers, the Chases, the Morgans, the Carnegies, these sorts of men of industry who created the American banking system, some of the original great corporations, and also some of the major media tycoons as well. Now, what Wilson says there about this power structure that everybody can feel, that's difficult to identify and seems to be everywhere, I think in a way has been identified by a really remarkable historian. He was British born. His name is Anthony Sutton. I don't know whether your listeners are perhaps aware of his work, but Anthony Sutton was a fellow at the Hoover Institute and Stanford University, and he's famous for having published a number of books documenting the history of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany's rise to power. And what Sutton found in doing the research he did is that there were a number of financial transactions and weapon transactions that occurred between American financiers and, for example, the Bolsheviks in Soviet Russia, and then later with Hitler's Germany as well. And the thing is, at the time that Sutton was doing this research, he couldn't understand, well, why is it that these American businessmen, financiers, CEOs, as it were, why would they be funding both sides, the communists and the Nazis? And it didn't make sense from a traditional geopolitical perspective of nation states and ideologies. And so it really puzzled him. Now, the story continues. Years later, he received in the mail a list of names of members of what purported to be a secret society at Yale University called Skull and Bones, which is now pretty famous. It's public record. People know about it. John Kerry, George H.W. and George W. Bush were members. And if you look at the roster list of the members of Skull and Bones, Anthony Sutton came to find that there was basically this secret history or this secret force working behind world events that he thought came to explain why, for example, American businessmen would be funding the Soviets and the Nazis at the same time. Now, the point that Sutton makes in his research is that Skull and Bones, the secret society at Yale University, isn't just acting alone. It seems to have liaison with other kinds of organizations, one of which, according to Sutton, is at Oxford. And the group, he calls it the group that's in Oxford, that has liaison with Skull and Bones at Yale University, is operated primarily out of All Souls College. All Souls College is a strictly research college. There's no students there. It's just all research fellows. And in the research that Sutton did, he came to find that the Rhodes Scholarship, which is a very famous academic scholarship at Oxford University, Bill Clinton was on a Rhodes Scholarship. That group of people, Rhodes and Milner and others, had a heavy hand in shaping the trajectory of higher education. And it's something similar that happened in the United States. At Yale University, Johns Hopkins University, Harvard University, many of our greatest universities were founded or funded by members of Skull and Bones. I'll give you just one example. There was a man, he's pretty obscure, I didn't know about him until I started reading Sutton, named Daniel Gilman. Now, Mr. Gilman was the second president of the University of California of Berkeley, the first president of Johns Hopkins University, And he was also the president, the founding president of the Carnegie Institute of Science. So you have all these media moguls, financial moguls that are pouring money into higher education. And they're determining the curricula that the students are taught, and they're also shaping the values of the university system. And so when you look at the Jeffrey Epstein situation, the question really becomes, why would Jeffrey Epstein be there? And I think the answer is that what Jeffrey Epstein represented, his view of the human being, his view for the future, his interests, align perfectly with the interests that are behind Yale University, Harvard University, Oxford University. And it's a very bleak image of man. It's a view that doesn't really respect human beings. It sees human beings as basically just objects to be manipulated and ordered and controlled. And so I think that's why Jeffrey Epstein was involved in a lot of this, is that those were his values. And we can get into what it was that he was even proposing to research at Harvard University. But all I just wanted to really lay out at this point is that Jeffrey Epstein just didn't show up at Harvard University by happenstance. There's a deep power structure that's been invested into these universities for many, many years, even centuries. And they have a clear vision of the kind of society that they want for us all. And the values that these scientists purport to hold and the research that they've been undertaking is completely consistent with Jeffrey Epstein's own value system, which is basically complete and total disregard of human value.
Yeah, it definitely, you can see the parallels when you look back at all of the founding of these schools and how higher education came to be. I've had nothing but shake my head moments as I've researched things like the Skull and Bones Club, et cetera, et cetera. And what people don't understand, and you still see people doing it on a regular basis, they don't understand that this transcends politics. This is about power. And it has nothing to do with politics or political parties. It has to do with consolidation of power and moving a narrative forward. And like you explained much better than I ever could, that's exactly what all of these people are about. It's all about the power.
I think that's entirely correct. And, one thing that I was hoping our letter would achieve is that the time frame involved as to when Jeffrey Epstein came to campus, the length of his relationship with some of the professors there, goes back much farther in time than is being admitted by the corporate media. And I know that this is something that, for example, Maria Farmer has mentioned a lot in some of the interviews that she's been giving recently. I think, as everybody at this point knows, she says that she went to law enforcement back in the 1990s with information about this. And so, the fact is that these professors at Harvard University, whether you're looking at Professor Alan Dershowitz or Professor Steven Pinker, Professor George Church, Professor Martin Nowak, these men have known Epstein for a very long time. And their relationship goes well beyond just funding that they're alleged to have received from Epstein. In my opinion, from a philosophical perspective, in evaluating their psychology, their research, their apparent motives, the comments that they've supplied on the public record explaining their reasons for being involved in Epstein, these are people who have a very clear conception of the future of humanity, what they want to achieve. And Jeffrey Epstein fit perfectly into that vision. Everybody, I think, knows about the bizarre research that he was undertaking in New Mexico with the eugenics and
the transhumanism and
Now, see, I mean, that's coming out of a philosophy. It's coming out of a view of man. These people, they try to conceal it in the name of science, but it's not science that they're doing. Their entire line of questioning, their way about questioning nature, their view of nature, it's all, as you said, about control and power. I would give you just one example. Take Professor George Church, the very notable biologist at Harvard. from what I understand, and I'm not an expert, but to the extent I understand what it is he's trying to do, he's even spoken openly about reversing aging. So it's clear that in some ways, these scientists are involved in a quest for immortality. Now, you mentioned transhumanism, and again, that's certainly part of the situation here. They want artificial intelligence. They want virtual reality. They want to live forever. They want to be gods. And that's an esoteric, ancient view. It goes back centuries. And I think what it's doing is it's rearing its head in the context of popular culture, through science fiction, through media, through technology, cell phones, the internet. But behind it is a worldview. And it's a deeply pernicious worldview. It's an anti-human view. And you see this manifest, I think, in the personal conduct of the people who are involved with Epstein and the just total disregard they have for others, the complete lack of responsibility that they display when confronted with their misdeeds. It's deeply disturbing.
And the clear lack of empathy for what the survivors have went through by not only these institutions, but by these professors and scientists has really agitated me. You know, if it was me who was involved with Jeffrey Epstein and I wasn't involved in anything he was doing as far as trafficking and it was just a professional relationship, I would be screaming from every single mountaintop about it. I wouldn't be hiding. I wouldn't be cowering. I would confront it. And I would admit that I was wrong for, hanging out with the man. But these people all seem to hide and think it's going to go away because the narrative has always been controlled by their lapdogs in the corporate media, in the legacy media. And now that part of their plan and their plot is no longer a tenable position for them, well, they're starting to panic now a little bit, it seems.
Yeah, I think what the plan here is, as so often when wrongdoers are caught in their wrongdoing, is to just ignore the situation and hope that eventually in time people move on and quit discussing it.
Yeah, that's definitely been their strategy throughout this whole entire thing from the first arrest on. And my message to them is, if a global pandemic hasn't stopped us from chasing you down, there is nothing that is going to stop this train from rolling into the station.
I would have to agree. To go back to a comment you made just a few moments ago regarding compassion, or I think you said empathy, it's clear that in some ways, if you look at the psychiatric diagnostic manuals and you look at the definition, the clinical definition of a narcissist, right, someone with a personality disorder, the people that we're discussing at Harvard University, at MIT, at these elite universities, they tend to be, in my experience, deeply narcissistic people, to the point where they are at the very least subclinical narcissists. They're very self-centered. They're very self-absorbed. They're very arrogant. They're very entitled. They tend to be cruel. They certainly lack compassion for others. And I would go a step further and say that part of the reason why they're unwilling to apologize in many cases for what they've done, or to offer a sort of very half-hearted apology, is because in their own minds, they don't actually believe they've done anything wrong.
Bingo.
Now, the reason why they don't want to actually come out and say they haven't done anything wrong, one reason is purely pragmatic, that because I think basically they live for pleasure and comfort, they don't want to be, from their perspective, bothered by people who are outraged with what others take to be a clearly disordered mindset. And so they just try to conceal it, and they don't really come forward and tell people how they really feel because they know people will criticize it. Two, I think they don't really want people to understand the agenda, the worldview behind what they're doing, and why it is, for example, that they lack what other people consider to be normal human emotions. Why are they so uncompassionate? Why do they lack empathy? Why don't they believe in moral responsibility? If you scratch beneath the surface, you'll come to find that, many of these people, they're wedded to a scientific worldview. They're very technocratic. Some of them, they might not even believe in human free will, right? So they don't even necessarily think that anybody really is responsible for his actions or decisions, because they don't even believe that free will exists. They see human beings as really nothing more than this sort of inconsequential happenstance result of purely evolutionary processes. They don't believe there's any human design in the universe. They certainly don't believe in a creator or a personal God that has laws that he expects humans to follow. And so it's a deeply nihilistic, valueless view. That's really just boils down to what we see, which is personal pleasure and the exploitation of others for one's own personal gain.
And we saw a lot of that with these academics and scientists. I know with they had so many different conferences that were attended by a lot of the premier scientists that we're talking about at Harvard. And there's nobody on this planet that's going to convince me that these people went down to that island and they were just there to eat dinner and to have a talk. You know, they would have to think all of us very, very naive if they believe that we're going to swallow that narrative. And it's like Dershowitz. He says he flew into Zorro Ranch, but only for an hour. I was just down at Zorro Ranch. There's no way you're flying down there for 1 hour to do what? What exactly are you doing there? It's in the middle of nowhere. And it's just over and over, you see the behavior with these people and you see the way they conduct themselves. And I shake my head on a regular basis when I hear these kind of people even talk, because it's even when they speak in news conferences, it's with a condescending tone.
Well, they're clearly legends in their own mind.
There's no doubt about that, especially Dershowitz.
Well, I should be careful about what exactly I say, but I have had an exchange with Professor Dershowitz about the letter. And he has told me that he is in the process of asking Harvard University to more thoroughly investigate himself, because in his view, this is going to exonerate him from any potential wrongdoing with regard to the situation. So we'll have to see. I mean, I haven't heard anything from Harvard. This maybe should have been something I mentioned at the outset. It slipped my mind at the time. But the letter was delivered by email on the 7th of May. I have confirmation that it arrived certified mail by post on the 11th, and we've not yet heard anything. It won't surprise me if we don't. As I mentioned, we had sent a series of letters to MIT. The president there never responded to our letters. Perhaps Harvard will be different. Maybe we'll get some kind of response. Although, I think the issue is that at this point, in some respects, Harvard and the corporate media has really already kind of said just about all they're willing to say. I mean, they've admitted to some of the facts, and then the reaction seems to be, well, let's just put Martin Nowak on leave and then go about our business. So in a way, I'm kind of sympathetic to the position in which the president at Harvard finds himself, because I'm not really sure that he's even able to address the letter, since our letter says that he should resign, and I clearly don't think he has any intention of doing that. So in a way, I guess it's fitting that we might not receive a response, since I don't really think there's anything for him to say.
Yeah, it would be par for the course for these sort of institutions to just ignore it. I can't tell you how many times I've reached out for clarification. And I was even, I went to the Santa Fe Institute to speak with some people there, and I was turned away there as well. So it really seems like nobody wants anybody shaking trees in this case for sure. And well, that's where I show up and just start to shake the trees, because when people are hiding information and they don't want to talk, usually that means there's something to hide. So once I start getting an idea that something could be a little bit amiss, I start to dig in a little bit deeper. And that was one of the motivating reasons for me going to New Mexico, is to talk to some people that had information about the Santa Fe Institute and what was going on there. And from the stuff that I've heard about that place, it's like something out of a Twilight Zone movie. It is.
No, I'm sure we would call it science fiction, but of course, what you come to understand is that what we call science fiction in some ways was created by the same kind of people involved in these societies. It's predictive programming, right? So the transhumanist agenda, the artificial intelligence agenda, these sorts of things have been introduced into the public consciousness through films for so long that we're being acclimated to it slowly. And so that we're even at a point where we accept it as science. You know, the idea that Professor Church is going to try to reverse aging. We just accept that as science. We don't have a debate about, well, is that even something we should be doing?
Yeah.
Right. So see, I guess maybe the point I'm making here is that these institutions like Harvard and MIT have been captured by people who don't even have a humanistic worldview. Their entire perspective is devoid of really any moral standard that leads them to think some things are off the table. Morally speaking, I'll give you an example. We just spoke of Professor Alan Dershowitz. I want to mention someone else in just a moment, but before I do that, in thinking about what's happened at MIT and at Harvard, I called to mind a turn of phrase that was coined back in the early 90s by Congressman Patrick Moynihan. And the idea he coined at the time was what he called defining deviancy down. And I have here an article from 1992 by a journalist, William Raspberry. He says, quote, "When our correcting mechanisms are overloaded, what was once deviant becomes acceptable," end quote. And then Raspberry concludes the short essay by quoting Moynihan. Moynihan says, "We are getting used to a lot of behavior that is not good for us," end quote. And I think that's the trouble here, is that when you read the Harvard report, which was released May 1st, when you read the report that MIT released, you think when you reach the end of the report, the president should say, well, for all these reasons, I hereby resign. You think that there should be a long list of administrators and faculty members who are either being terminated for cause or at least just have the moral decency to think that even if they haven't been caught in an explicit policy violation of some kind, just have the moral decency to step down. And that's not what happens. And so I think what we're seeing at Harvard and MIT, and more generally in higher education, but specifically with this Epstein situation, is that our threshold for unethical, immoral behavior has become so high that even having a convicted level 3 sex offender maintain an office at Harvard University isn't enough to generate an outcry. There's just many people in my profession who, for whatever reason, and I can speculate about what their reasons may be, they're just more than prepared to tolerate it. I'll give you the example I had in mind. That's Professor Steven Pinker. Now, I don't know how much you may have had to say about him already on the podcast, but I shared the letter with Professor Pinker last week, and he had the decency to respond. I appreciated his willingness to do so. But in the course of the exchange I had with him, it became clear to me that he just wasn't convinced that he had done anything wrong. He was very defensive, adamant indeed, that he wanted to say, listen, what the letter has stated is what he was calling guilt by association. And so I think from the perspective of Professor Pinker, we shouldn't have mentioned him in the letter, because from his perspective, he hadn't done anything wrong. Now, what I mentioned to him is I said, well, listen, my understanding is that I think in 2011, there was an EDGE organization event in Napa, in California, and Professor Pinker gave a lecture at a seminar as part of that event, which also included, by the way, I think a speaking engagement from Professor Martin Nowak as well. And at Professor Pinker's talk, Jeffrey Epstein is sitting there right in the audience, about 15 feet away from Pinker. So, listen, I mean, I know everybody has different thresholds for what they're willing to tolerate, but I can say that if I were giving a talk, I certainly wouldn't have welcomed a convicted level 3 sex offender to sit in attendance at my talk. I would have asked him to leave. And I wouldn't have wanted to be associated with an institution or an organization like EDGE that's willing to give Epstein a platform. Now, Pinker admits that Epstein was there. He's known Epstein to some degree or another for years. He flew on Epstein's plane in 2002 on the way to the TED Talk. Clearly ran into Epstein on multiple occasions at Harvard University and elsewhere. But from Pinker's perspective, that's, quote, just mere guilt by association. My perspective is that it's wrong to have had the association with Epstein that he did, and Pinker just doesn't see it that way. I don't really know what more you're supposed to say to somebody when they're in that situation and they still believe that their behavior is defensible, when in my opinion it just clearly isn't.
Yeah, there's no right-thinking person that could defend the enabling of somebody like Jeffrey Epstein. And like it or not, that's what these scientists and these academics did. They enabled Jeffrey Epstein, they gave him credibility, and they opened that door for him to take the first step back into polite society. And it's disgusting and disheartening that they're so caught up in their own hubris that they can't see that.
I agree. And the question I have is, I understand that one can't know the secrets of the heart. Only God knows. I mean, so I can't say with any degree of certitude why it is that a particular individual has been motivated to behave the way he has. But I can say, in general, there have to be forces at work that explain why. For example, the Boston Globe right now isn't in the midst, to my knowledge anyway, in the process of conducting some kind of investigative series similar to the one that the Miami Herald did. Where's the reporting from the New York Times?
Yep.
Where's the reporting from the Wall Street Journal? Where are senior academics from any of these bioethics institutes, whether they're at Harvard or elsewhere, coming forward and issuing public statements and writing op-eds condemning what happened at Harvard and reflecting on the state of higher education and trying to come to terms with how it is this was possible? That's just not happening. It's just not happening.
Well, let's hope that you stepping forward and your colleagues coming forward and putting their name behind the letter, let's hope that it starts a trend and other people have the courage to start coming forward and calling out the behavior of these obviously very, 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 I don't even know what to call them, very disturbed individuals, because anyone who thinks that hanging out with a man who has been convicted of sex crimes is a good idea is not somebody that I want in charge of my children's education, that's for sure.
No, and you would think that that's how my colleagues in higher education should feel as well, many of whom are parents, have children of their own. I wonder, going back to the jumping off point with the quotation from President Woodrow Wilson, what he said about this power that everybody knows is there. I wonder, because I know these people, many of them personally, for years. I've taught at Oxford. I've taught at Wake Forest University. I've traveled the world at different universities to give lectures in England, Scotland, France, the Netherlands, all over. I know hundreds and hundreds of people from my time as a student in graduate school on into an instructor. I have a really active research agenda, publishing record, and I have a great career as a philosopher, and I really value the work that I do, and I think there's great value in it. And I'm really pleased and grateful for the professional connections that I have with people who have enabled me to produce the work that I do. But frankly, at the end of the day, I'm a human being. And I just don't understand how it is that so many people evidently appear willing to just ignore what I think is the greatest scandal in the history of higher education. And, I should be clear that today, speaking to you today, I'm speaking purely on my own behalf. I'm certainly not speaking in any official capacity for Wolf University, where I teach currently. I'm not speaking officially on the behalf of anybody who is involved in organizing the Uncoke My Campus petition. I have no affiliation with them. And I also am not speaking for anybody who signed the letter with me. These are just my own opinions, my own impressions based off of my experience through the years, seeing what I've seen and doing the research I have done. But I do say that regardless of how one wants to explain the situation, it's undeniable that Jeffrey Epstein's involvement in higher education just simply isn't receiving the attention that it deserves. And, toward the beginning of our conversation, I had mentioned Daniel Dennett and John Searle. I mentioned them because for a few reasons, one of which is that both Searle and Dennett spent time at Oxford at Christ Church. The other reason is that John Searle was recently embroiled in a really significant sexual harassment scandal at Berkeley. And the University of California, Berkeley finally stripped him of his emeritus status because of those allegations. And at the time that the news broke about John Searle in the philosophy profession, there was a lot of discussion about it. There was a flurry of letters written to Berkeley and elsewhere about it. I think there were petitions, of course, too. And that's been the situation with other sexual harassment scandals in academic philosophy. Now, Dennett flew on Epstein's plane in 2002, along with Pinker, along with Richard Dawkins, and along with John Brockman. Now, I've spoken to Dennett. He's read the letter. He had something to say about it, which was nice of him. And I also understand that last July, when Epstein was arrested, Dennett went on Twitter and said that he was one of the few people to speak out about Epstein and try to highlight Epstein's connections to Trump. But the point that I would like to make is that if, as a profession, academic philosophy has been more than willing to comment on sexual harassment scandals involving, for example, John Searle, who has a connection into Edge organization with Brockman, why is it now that nobody is talking about Edge organization? Why is it that nobody's talking about John Brockman? Why is it that nobody's talking about Jeffrey Epstein? What's going on?
And you would think with Brockman especially being the gatekeeper for, that the literary world when it comes to writing, people who are doing scientists, et cetera, who are publishing books, Brockman his agency was the top-notch agency for getting those people their book deals and stuff. So Brockman has intimate knowledge of what went on with Jeffrey Epstein, and there's nobody that can convince me differently of that.
Oh, no, certainly. I mean, he must have known quite a bit, I would think. I don't see how it could be the case that he didn't.
Yep, and I think you're right. It's an aspect of this case that definitely needs more attention. I've done a few episodes on Brockman, and I've been working on a closer look, going deeper into the world of these higher education schools. So I'm working on that right now, and I'm going to have a little bit more about Brockman in the next few weeks. But I think it's something that needs to be touched on by other content creators as well, because there's a lot to uncover there.
Well, I think maybe perhaps this is the final thing I should say. I know you've already kept me long enough. It's really kind of you. But, an important angle to all this is, let's think back to what everybody knows Acosta said.
Yep.
Which is that Epstein's intelligence.
Yep, hands off. He's above your pay grade.
Okay, so listen, we know that intelligence is heavily involved in Hollywood.
Yep.
We know that intelligence is heavily involved in corporate media.
Yep.
We know that intelligence is heavily involved in corporate America. And why wouldn't intelligence be heavily involved in higher education?
Exactly.
I mean, of course they are. So when you look at Jeffrey Epstein's connections into state intelligence, you look at his involvement in blackmail, you look at his interest in so-called scientific research that's being funded by government scientists with DARPA, the Department of Defense, the transhumanist agenda, artificial intelligence. I find it really difficult to believe that part of the reason we're seeing such a little outcry from anybody in higher education has something to do with the intelligence component here.
Yeah, they have their fingers in every single pie, and the Five Eyes of intelligence around the world are responsible for just about all of the sorrow that we're seeing going on right now, from their involvement in the so-called American Spring to all of their regime changes in South America. It makes my head want to explode.
Right, and I think I saw today before I came on the show with you that you mentioned that you're intending to maybe explore some of the different scientific projects that Epstein was involved in. And I think that's certainly important. It's really timely because, when we look at the technocracy we're living in, the culture of expertise, this idea that we're supposed to just defer to these prestigious institutions of higher education, the idea of medical expertise, corporate expertise, that you're just going to be told what to do, right? Bill Gates is just going to show up with a plan to force vaccinate the entire world, and we're all just supposed to go along with that. Well, I mean, as you know, Bill Gates has problems of his own, from what I understand, when it comes to Epstein.
Oh, big time.
You know, I mean, so my question, right, is as a common citizen, is why am I being forced to accept the notion that I should be living in a society where institutions like Harvard University and MIT, with their government-funded research that's coming out of the intelligence and defense world, that has no regard for human value, no regard for the truth, that people like that working with technocrats like Bill Gates, all of whom have some kind of, at the very least, tangential relation to a sex trafficking operation, are supposed to just rule the world.
And they expect us all just to sit back and accept it. And I think that, you know, for so long they were able to run that on us because the legacy media controlled the narrative. But now with independent content creators and independent journalists and voices speaking out, I don't think that they know how to go forward without controlling the narrative. I think they're definitely on their heels. And I think that if the pressure is kept up, we'll see the facade truly break.
Well, yeah, let's look at Harvard one final time here. A few days ago, I believe you read an article coming out of the Harvard Crimson, the student paper there.
Yes.
And there was a article that was issued, I think, by the editorial board.
Yes, it was.
I thought it was a pretty strong piece, considering the source. I mean, I'm sure that they're under incredible pressure not really to cover this story to the extent that a truly independent venue would be able to. But to their credit, they did get some important points on the record, and clearly they weren't pleased at all with Harvard's handling of the situation. But, you know, let's look at the background of the Harvard Crimson. I mean, David Rockefeller, from my understanding, when he was at Harvard, was an editor at the Harvard Crimson. So I think what's going on is that you have this top-down corruption where you have key people, as we've seen at the FBI, key people at the CIA, key people in government, key people in media, key people in Hollywood, key people in academia who control things. And, you know, I noticed in reading that Harvard Crimson piece, my impression, having dealt a little bit with the legacy media, with reporters and editors at the Boston Globe, for example, people at the New York Times, it looked to me, and I could be mistaken, but it looked to me like some of the fellows who were on the Dubin Fellowships have written some kind of letter to Harvard, and that they were supplying comment to the paper because of that letter. But you notice that, at least from what I recall, the Harvard Crimson doesn't mention anything about whether there is such a letter, and it certainly wasn't published.
No, they didn't mention anything about that.
No, so see, what I'm saying is that, again, I apologize to anybody at the Crimson if I'm simply mistaken about this, but my impression is that the Crimson was forced to say something about the blowback they're receiving from these fellows, because there are people at Harvard who know, for example, that letter exists. And so they're not letting everybody else at Harvard and outside Harvard see the letter for themselves, because it's embarrassing to see what they've had to say about what has happened at Harvard. And so even at the level of the student paper at Harvard University, you see the narrative being sculpted. In my opinion, is that there's probably a number of great student journalists and editors there who want to do more with this story, and they're being told by the administration that they're just not allowed to do so.
Getting their first taste of what a newsroom is truly like when an editor comes in and crushes your story.
Exactly.
And we see that a lot. You know, the corporate media, I know I rail about this all the time. The legacy media is a disgrace. It's a dumpster fire. And everything that they tell me, I vet on my own. I don't believe a word that comes out of the legacy media at this point.
Well, I think that's just wise to do so. I think it would be foolish not to. I mean, look at what Maria Farmer has had to say about how she's been treated by the corporate media, going back, of course, to what she's had to say regarding Vicky Ward at CNN.
Yeah, the treatment that Maria received from the media really is, it's beyond the pale. The way that they treated her, the way that they tried to force her into interviews, chase her down, bother her, the whole nine. It's just, Maria's story is so heart-wrenching and so disturbing that it really launched me into another level of anger once I started to get to know Maria on a personal level. And I'll be very upfront and very straight. And I have a bias when it comes to Maria at this point. Her and I have become friends. And her story and what she has gone through and the courage that she has shown it just cannot be understated.
Yeah, I think what she's done is absolutely amazing. And I find her experience and the way that she's handled all the mistreatment that she's received truly inspiring. And, I wish I could do more. I think the least certainly I could do is just send this letter. I should mention that for all I know, there could be others who are doing their part behind the scenes. We don't really know what's going on at MIT and Harvard. So I don't want to just throw everybody under the bus and condemn those institutions entirely, because I do believe there are pockets of resistance. But frankly, at this point, be that as it may, not much is spilling onto the public record. And the reason why that is to go back to what Maria Farmer said. I like to just, to the extent I can, corroborate her impressions of what she's been telling people, because when she said that she was going through photo albums with Maxwell and looking through the royals, and Maxwell told her that the great protectors of the Maxwell family are the Rothschilds. Well, that lines up with what Anthony Sutton said in his research of Skull and Bones, and then the group at Oxford. It lines up with my own experience at Oxford and seeing how things work there. And it lines up perfectly with the response that we're seeing from MIT and Harvard, which is basically to just issue a report sort of summarizing some of the surface facts and then just move on and hope everybody forgets.
Yep, they're hoping that, the 24-hour news cycle just buries it in the tsunami of other news, but that's not going to occur this time. I think they've miscalculated. I think they've made a mistake, and I think this is going to be a very, very damaging mistake that they've made, because I truly believe if you look back to where we started when Epstein was first arrested and to where we're at today and how many people have been knocked out off their perch from Dubin to Wexner, the progress that has been made is it's pretty impressive, to be honest with you. These are very powerful people that have been knocked off their perch. And of course, it's not an indictment, or they're not getting perp walked, but we have to walk before we run. And I think it was crucial to begin showing everybody just how disgusting these people are. And their whole entire suit of armor that they've built through their charitable works and their lapdogs in the legacy media is crashing down around them at this point.
I agree. My hope is that we'll hear something of a formal response from Harvard. My further hope is that for those who know Jeffrey Epstein and claim that they had nothing to do with the illegal and illicit activity he was involved in, that they would step up then and demonstrate that publicly by coming out and actually demanding a genuine, transparent investigation, so that we get to the bottom of things. I would mention just one example. This is something I spoke with Professor Dershowitz about. Footnote 13 of the May 1st Harvard report admits that a number of Harvard faculty traveled to Epstein's properties throughout the years, but the report declines to disclose those details because it claims that that's a personal matter. Well, I have to disagree, and so my hope is that Harvard will disclose those details, because as far as I can understand, anybody who traveled to Jeffrey Epstein's properties on or about the time that we now know the crimes in question leading to his arrest took place is a potential suspect in what should be an ongoing FBI investigation.
Oh, there's zero doubt. I'm from New York originally. I have a lot of friends who have had their lives ruined by the FBI and RICO investigations due to something as mundane as so-called illegal sports gambling, which is legal everywhere now. They've had their houses raided, in prison for 7 years in federal prison. And this guy gets to walk the way he does. He doesn't have any sort of real punishment. His co-conspirators don't get slapped with RICO indictments. And the only two charges that we're looking at now are the two prison guards. It just doesn't sit well with me, and we really, really, really need to keep the pressure up.
I agree.
All right.
If you have anything you'd like to ask me, great, but you've already been really patient with your time. I do appreciate it. And, I'd like to just wish you continued progress with the podcast, and hopefully the conversation we've had today will contribute something to those efforts.
I'll tell you what, there aren't many times where I'm blown away by a conversation and I'm pumped to have a conversation the way I was to speak with you today. So I'm very, very thankful that you came onto the podcast. This is a lot to digest. This is such good information coming from somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. And you coming on the podcast to educate the listeners and the audience, what that does is it gives them the tools to go forward and continue with their own investigations, because really what we have is thousands upon thousands of citizen journalists who are chasing down this case. So if we arm them with the proper tools, I have no doubt that we're all going to end up at the right destination.
I agree, and I might add finally, the letter that was sent to Harvard is available publicly. One of the people who signed the letter with me, Dave Rapich, he's an economics professor. He maintains a wonderful site called Academic Capture, where he's been documenting for a number of years instances of bad philanthropy in higher education. He has tabs for both MIT and Harvard, where you can find the letter that just went to Harvard, as well as the original letters that went to MIT. And I would encourage anybody who's interested to go read those letters for themselves, and do feel free to distribute them with whomever they may wish.
And now, do you have any social media sites or a website where people can find you or any of your work?
Well, no, so I don't have Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. I have what's called an academia account where I just post my work. And my publications, my books are available on Barnes & Noble, Amazon, those sorts of retailers. So if they're interested in learning more about my work, that's available. And I have a website too, so if anyone would like to reach out to me and contact me for any reason, they should feel free to send me an email, and I'll do my best to be in touch with them.
Awesome. Well, Dr. DeLay, thank you so much for joining us. I really look forward to having you back at some point when we get a little bit of movement here in the case, and you can come on and add to what we've already talked about. And I really appreciate you reaching out to me, because this has been quite the learning experience and one of the best hours I've spent in quite some time.
Well, thank you very much. Just keep up the good work.
Thank you very much, Dr. DeLay. I hope you have a fantastic day, sir.
Okay, be well.
All right, take care, sir. All right, everybody. So if you'd like to contact me, you can do that at bobbycapucci@protonmail.com. That's BOBBYCAPUCCI at protonmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter at BOBBY_CAPUCCI. Boy, oh boy, was that an adventure. That was a fantastic hour and 7 minutes of radio. That was very informative, and I know that all of the listeners out there are going to get out of that just as much as I did. Thank you all for your continued support. Thank you all for your continued fighting to get justice in this case, and most importantly, thank you all for tuning into the podcast once again, and we're going to keep going, folks. I'm going to keep trying to get folks onto the podcast like Dr. DeLay, people that can speak to you from a position of experience, from a position of knowledge, and all we can do is arm ourselves with the information that we need to move forward and get justice finally in this case.